What's up, guys? Jared here. So, I finally saw the ultimate collab, Spider-Man No Way Home, where Spider-Man, all the different Spider-Men from all the different movies and all the villains from the movies except for James Franco because he's canceled, and I guess they also left out Dane DeHaan. Maybe they just left out that whole Harry Osborn character because James Franco is in that much trouble, but I digress. Finally saw the movie, and there's a reason that I waited so long to see it that I'll get to in a little bit. Now, before we get started with the review, at the risk of losing watch time, I do want to admit here that I am not 100% caught up on Marvel. I haven't seen any of the Disney Plus shows. I never saw Black Widow. But I am going to provide a perspective on this movie from a hardcore cinephile who really appreciates this movie. Spoilers, I like the movie. I like the movie a lot, and there's a lot to respect about it. And so, if you are a big Marvel fan, if you're really into the lore, I ask you, don't click off, because I think that this movie has a lot of very positive things to say about the state of cinema, which is not something that I would have imagined I would say about a Marvel movie. So let's get started. Just like the other reviews that I've done recently, I'm going to start off talking about the qualitative elements of the movie, what was good, what wasn't good. Then I'm going to talk about how I think this movie and its achievements are relevant in the greater state of cinema at the moment as we move into 2022. And then finally, I'm going to leave with some predictions and some hot takes about the future of cinema and what this movie means for the future of cinema. So let me just start off by saying that I think that these Spider-Man movies, the 3 Spider-Man movies in the MCU so far, well, I guess you can say there are many more movies than that in the MCU, but you see what I'm saying. They're kind of the gold standard of the MCU, in my opinion. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that for Homecoming, the filmmakers chose to draw inspiration from John Hughes, the director of films like The Breakfast Club, and that movie in particular is most clearly one of the films that inspired Spider-Man Homecoming, and I think that that influence carries on throughout these movies. He was called the Shakespeare of teen angst because he really portrayed teen problems in a way that emotionally resonated with everyone. I mean, I didn't see The Breakfast Club until I was in my 20s, and I could not believe how emotionally impacted I was by some teenage problems that seemed very specific to the 80s in some ways. But that movie still resonates today, and if you're a Marvel fan and if you're a Spider-Man fan, you got to check that movie out because it's just amazing today as it was back then. But I digress. Why do I think this is so important to talk about when talking about Spider-Man No Way Home? Is because what I'm going to be talking about in this review is that I think one of the movie's greatest accomplishments, and I think probably one of the greatest accomplishments that can be achieved in cinema in general, is the ability to tell an emotional story that does not pull punches. But before I get further into that, let me just talk more about some of the things that this movie does really well. This movie moves. I mean, less than 2 minutes from the movie starting, we have immediate conflict. I mean, basically, it's like the first thing that happens. We find out Spider-Man is Peter Parker. He freaks out, calls his friends, dude. This movie respects your attention. It moves quickly. And then a cool 15 minutes in, the conflict escalates when Doctor Strange messes up the spell. And this is also, an obvious trap that occurs when you're creating these interconnected movies, is that someone who is not caught up on the lore, somebody who has not seen previous Marvel movies or even previous Spider-Man movies, might get lost. But everybody knows the basic premise that a superhero has a secret identity, and by starting the movie immediately, knowing that our protagonist's identity has been compromised, even people who know the bare minimum about Spider-Man or Marvel are not only immediately brought into the conflict and brought into the action, but they know enough just based on the concept of a superhero to be sucked in and for the movie to start drawing them in and to not take the audience's attention for granted. I mean, our attention spans, especially these days, are not charity. And I think this movie does a really good job of starting out establishing the conflict immediately and establishing a very good pace that carries out throughout the movie. I also think that this movie balances multiple villains very gracefully. Probably the most graceful multi-villain movie since probably the first Avengers. It definitely does it better than Spider-Man 3 or Amazing Spider-Man 2, even though this movie has many more villains than both of those movies. Overall, I think this movie is not successful because of the spectacle or even because of, the big marketing event of having all of these different worlds collide. I think this movie works really well because it is a bunch of really talented actors given very strong characters that go through very powerful emotional arcs. And it's done so with some of the greatest actors we have alive. I mean, we have Zendaya, who, I just hope that cinema gets to a point where we can still be giving talented actors like her and Tom Holland really meaty roles, because I think that, they're doing a great job with Spider-Man, and in some sense, they really are elevating Spider-Man to a place that it hasn't really previously been, but I just think that they clearly have enormous talent. And not only that, but we have Benedict Cumberbatch, Willem Dafoe, Alfred Molina, Jamie Foxx. These actors are incredible, and they're doing good work. The famous director Paul Thomas Anderson, who most recently made Licorice Pizza, which unfortunately I haven't seen yet because it's not playing out here in Helsinki, but he talks about how, over 60, 90%, I don't remember exactly the number he said, but most of directing is just casting. It's just finding the right people, the right talent to bring that character to life. And, mostly based on the fact that this movie is drawing from all this legacy, they were able to bring together a cast that just really, really nails it. And I think that a lot of people say that this movie is mostly successful because of nostalgia. I mean, even people that are saying that to compliment the movie are saying that, it was really great to sit in that theater and just soak up the nostalgia. I kind of disagree with that. I think that cheapens it. Willem Dafoe isn't a compelling villain because of the nostalgia of the first movie. Willem Dafoe is a compelling villain because he's one of the greatest actors of all time. I mean, that dude is almost the GOAT. And it's just so... Oh man, seeing him do that Green Goblin growl and that Green Goblin voice, I mean, that is freaking terrifying, whether or not you've seen the first Spider-Man movie with Tobey Maguire. And so I think that, sure, there's an element of nostalgia, definitely for Spider-Man fans, but those performances work, I think, in a vacuum. They really do. Also, as an exercise of bringing different IP, or really the same IP, but bringing different franchises of the same IP within the same world, I thought it was actually kind of interesting because, in a way, I felt like this continuation of the story redeemed some of the faults in some of those previous Spider-Man incarnations. So, for example, I think probably the worst Spider-Man movie of those generations is probably Amazing Spider-Man 2. I mean, that's my opinion. But for example, I felt nothing when Gwen died in Spider-Man 2. But I did this time when Andrew Garfield rescues MJ from falling to her death in a visually similar manner that Gwen did at the end of Amazing Spider-Man 2. And in a sense, I feel like that kind of... recast my understanding or recast my reaction to seeing it in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. And it kind of, almost made me feel an emotional connection to an event that I previously did not feel. So, one thing that's actually exciting about this ability to kind of bring old retired characters into these new vivid worlds that are built a little bit better and perhaps have better storytelling talent behind them is that it can almost bring new life into them. Now, granted, this is a very sensitive thing, and this can easily go wrong, and you can easily kind of tarnish the reputation of these older movies. I mean, especially the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies still have so much cultural capital and are still so beloved that, there was a great risk that if this movie turned out bad, it could kind of compromise the legacy of those movies. But I don't think it did at all. I think it did justice at the very least to the Tobey Maguire movies, and in a sense, I think it enhanced the Andrew Garfield movies. Now, let's talk more about just this idea of bringing in the other Spider-Men. This was obviously a very strong choice, obviously a choice that fans are going to get very excited by, but I think that not enough appreciation has gone into the fact of how they did this, because it could have very obviously, it could have very clearly, it could have easily been just a cheap gimmick, and it could have just felt stuffed in there, and the movie could have felt bloated and unnecessary and awkward, but it didn't. And the reason why is that these Spider-Men are there to help on Tom Holland's emotional journey. And this all comes to great power, great responsibility. One of the things that I really like about these most recent Spider-Man movies is how the notion of great power and great responsibility is constantly developing. So in the first movie, in Spider-Man Homecoming, it was very much, is Peter responsible enough to wield great power without messing everything up? Which is why Tony Stark was constantly taking the suit away, because he's just too much of a kid. He's not responsible enough. Then in the second movie, it was like, can he rise to the occasion to accept the incredible amount of responsibility that comes with filling Tony Stark's shoes after Tony has died, And then in this one, I think something really smart happens, is that the great power, great responsibility thing transitions into, can Peter Parker accept the responsibility that comes with great power? In the same way that the Peter Parker of the Tobey Maguire franchise and the Spider-Man of the Andrew Garfield franchise did. Because Tom Holland's Spider-Man has, in a sense, matured to face the same conundrum as the previous Peters. Because like Tobey and Garfield's Spider-Man, in this movie, Tom Holland has to decide whether his secret identity destroys the lives of his loved ones. So in this movie, he experiences a loss in the vein of Tobey losing Uncle Ben, or of Andrew Garfield losing Gwen, and now Tom Holland loses Aunt May. And the previous Spider-Man, their emotional experience from the other movies comes to guide our protagonist as he enters a kind of adulthood, an emotional adulthood, that I also think is actually quite cleverly framed as like he's framed by this idea of college admission, which is also very reminiscent of one of my favorite coming-of-age films, Tom Cruise in Risky Business. But not only that, not only is he claiming responsibility for making life or death decisions for victims or the villains, but again, now he's responsible for how his life can affect his loved ones. And that very much, spoilers, goes into his decision at the end of the movie to allow MJ and his best friend to go to MIT without him, because he realizes, just like Peter Parker struggled with in the Tobey Maguire franchise and in the Andrew Garfield franchise, that his identity as Spider-Man does have effects, potentially very negative effects, on his loved ones. And so it wasn't just a marketing spectacle to bring these characters back. I mean, I guess at the end of the day it was. I mean, we're all smart enough to realize that that's probably, at the end of the day, it was for a marketing effort and, the viral potential of this movie that ultimately allowed this to happen and allowed for it to make financial sense. But it justified it by enhancing the emotional impact of the movie. And emotional impact is, the fuel that cinema runs on. And I am so happy that this movie went in that direction, that they were really smart about how do we bring these other Spider-Men in to make it a better movie. A better movie, not only in it being a more clever movie or especially a more self-aware movie, but a more emotional movie. A movie that impacts its audience, something that the audience can feel. Because if you're going to do some kind of stunt that turns your movie into a viral marketing event, you should justify it by allowing these elements to make the movie work better, to resonate emotionally. And now this is where I'm going to be talking about a little bit of how I see this movie resonating in the landscape of cinema, late 2021, early 2022. And I never thought I'd hear myself say this, but I actually do think that this Spider-Man movie is one of the more courageous, braver films of the last year. I never thought I'd say that, but here we are. The reason it took me a long time to watch this movie is because I was so afraid that it was going to be just chock full of cringy, self-aware fan service. Because if I have to watch another movie where the film is constantly apologizing for being unnecessary or commenting on the cynical motives that led to its production, I'm going to lose my shit. The new Scream, the new Matrix, they all feel like they have to comment on how there didn't need to be another movie. And if you can say that about Scream 5 or Matrix 4, you can certainly say that about these movies. I mean, Spider-Man for many years was kind of the butt of a joke in the industry because it was just being constantly rebooted, and it was being constantly rebooted for industry reasons. You know, Avi Arad, who was the producer on the first Spider-Man movies and then the ensuing Spider-Man films with Andrew Garfield, you know, he rebooted this because he had to produce a certain number of Spider-Man movies per time period in order to maintain the IP rights. But it wasn't like that. In a landscape of recently of movies that are constantly hedging their bets with smarmy self-awareness or incessantly relying on undercutting the seriousness of an emotional moment as if to not feel too sentimental, this movie was a breath of fresh air because this movie emotionally does not pull the punches. It does not shy away from emotion. And this kind of ironic detachment was really big in earlier Marvel phases, like the Joss Whedon era. I mean, the first Avengers movie, Avengers 2, is just all over it. Is just, and even Guardians 1 to an extent. Every time that there's some kind of emotional moment, it's undercut by either a joke or by undercutting the seriousness of the emotional moment as if to, you know, in a sense, hedge our bets against becoming too, you know, emotional, too sentimental. And I think that, you know, one of the great brave things about this movie is that it doesn't do that. You know, we actually hear Aunt May say, with great power comes great responsibility. Even though when I was watching her say that, I was like, oh, she's actually not going to say the same thing. We're going to have Tom Holland say something like, oh yeah, I know what you're going to say, or something like that. There's going to be some kind of self-awareness or some kind of wink to the audience that we all know what she's going to say before she finishes saying it. But there wasn't that. That she just said it. They just went for it. And I think that that's one of the reasons this movie is so good, is because they really took what I think is actually the much bolder choice, is to double down into emotion and not to, you know, protect yourself against it not working by being, you know, a little bit ironic, because that's, you know, that's the hard stuff. Making an emotional movie is hard. Making a clever movie, I think they want you to believe that it's hard and brave, but it's really not. So I guess my point is, it's not hard to imagine a version of this movie that is constantly meta, constantly bringing awareness to either the number of reboots that the franchise has had within a short period of time, the IP rights fiasco with Marvel and Sony, the bad sequels sinking the previous franchises, Spider-Man 3, and Amazing Spider-Man 2. I mean, you know, I was even expecting them to call attention to the absurdity of the three Peter Parkers, these scientists, cooking up cures for a variety of different complex ailments for the villains, but they didn't. You know, that's something that would have happened in the Joss Whedon era. That definitely would have happened with, like, Deadpool, but that's kind of its own thing. But no, they just, you know, it doesn't matter that that's not very believable, because if you are confident enough in nailing performance, tone, pace, emotion, and conflict, it doesn't matter. People will suspend disbelief because you have mastered those elements. And this movie does it all. It nails all of it. And really, I think the much more courageous thing is going into a movie saying that I'm not going to be clever, I'm not going to be self-aware, I'm going to just go all in trying to nail performance, tone, pace, emotion, and conflict. You know, the building blocks for a successful piece of cinema. And this movie did it. And I think that's real bravery. Not something I expected myself to say from a Marvel movie. Now, in all fairness, I do want to kind of temper what I said, is that there is some meta stuff going on here, but I really don't think it's too egregious. So, for example, calling Andrew Garfield amazing over and over, definitely Andrew Garfield needing to hear that he's amazing is kind of reflecting on his short-lived failed franchise that isn't remembered so fondly. then, of course, there's Willem Dafoe saying, I'm somewhat of a scientist, kind of reflecting on the popular meme. There's also Tobey Maguire saying that his back hurts, which is not only a reference to an injury that he sustained in the filming of, I believe, the second Spider-Man movie, but also an actual line that he says in the second movie. And then lastly, there's Jamie Foxx saying that he wished that Spider-Man was black and that there has to be a black Spider-Man somewhere. I could have done without a lot of these things, but at the end of the day, I think they worked because it was believable that these characters would say these things just within the text. It made sense within the text before necessarily having to make sense within the subtext. Willem Dafoe's character has said, I'm somewhat of a scientist before. I think it's believable for him to say it again. And so, those kind of meta moments, those self-aware kind of quote-unquote Easter eggs, they're there as an extra, but there should never be a point where a piece of the text only works as subtext. Like, it only works as a reference to a meme and doesn't make sense within the context of the story, because then it just breaks the story, it breaks the suspension of disbelief, and is really just there for, I think, a joke that ultimately kind of compromises the integrity of the story that you're building. But I think that this movie, I think it did a good job of paying lip service to, some of the self-aware elements, but not in a way that ever compromised the storytelling. In terms of this movie's importance in the landscape of cinema, I think that this movie, especially with The Matrix and Scream coming out recently, and just, in a sense, it's more appropriate for Scream because Scream has always been very self-reflective. The Matrix less so. But let's just focus on The Matrix because, for those of you who are subscribed to the channel, you know that it's something that's very important to me. But The Matrix Resurrections basically boils down to the first half of the movie is criticizing the system that taints the integrity of the Matrix as art, and then trying, and then in my opinion, ultimately failing to reassert the potency of that art despite the system. But I guess my problem is it just doesn't achieve it. So if you truly believe, as the cynical studio execs in The Matrix do in the final credit scene, that narrative is dead and that entertainment is just viral conditioning and neural trigger responses, if you're trying to disprove that, and I think that very much Lana Wachowski was trying to kind of disprove that by saying, these cynical studio heads caught in The Matrix, this horrible oppressive system that, takes art and neuters it of meaning. And then, of course, there's, the subtextual stuff about capitalism in there. But if you're trying to criticize them, then it really, really matters that you present a product, the second half of the movie, that works emotionally, tonally, visually, and rhythmically. But the problem is it doesn't. The Matrix Resurrections, that second half of the movie, does not resonate emotionally. At least to me. I can only really speak from my subjective experience watching the movie. However, I will say that it's really hard to say that the movie doesn't at least look horrible. I mean, there are parts in that last scene with Neil Patrick Harris and Neo and Trinity where Neo and Trinity are shot in a way where they just look silly in those trench coats. I mean, I'm going down a little bit of a rabbit hole here, but I'll just make this quick. If you visit a movie set and you see whether it's Captain America or Spider-Man, if you see these actors in their costumes, they look stupid. It is the cinematographer and the filmmaker's job to paint with light to make them look awesome. And I feel like that fundamental quality was just not there in The Matrix Resurrections. And as a result, it looks very digital. It has that Netflix feel. And as a result, our superheroes in their costumes look stupid. And, so just on that very fundamental building block of creating a believable universe, I think that movie fails. So even if the Neo Trinity love scene stuff does work for you, I think it's just hard to say that the movie doesn't take you out with just how horrible it looks aesthetically. And the reason Spider-Man is such a humiliation to The Matrix Resurrections is because this movie, Spider-Man, doesn't get more bottom line oriented than a Marvel movie made by Disney that brings together characters from 20 years of superhero movies across franchises. A decision that was obviously motivated by financial reasons, just like it was egregiously admitted that The Matrix 4 was. But then again, every movie is motivated by financial reasons, especially at this stage in cinema. And yet, Spider-Man didn't feel the need to apologize or to employ irony to distance themselves from transgressing the unwritten rule that franchises ought to stay apart, or the unwritten rule in the case of The Matrix that the trilogy should maintain itself as a self-contained trilogy. They just told a good story. They didn't hedge their bets just in case this attempt to reawaken 20-year-old nostalgia fails. They swung hard emotionally, and they hit the mark. I mean, The Matrix Resurrections hedges their bets so egregiously that some have even come up with what I think is an asinine thesis that Lana Wachowski made the movie bad on purpose to sink the franchise. Now, let me just briefly say why I think that's a ridiculous thing to say, is because this doesn't happen in Hollywood. I mean, someone's career in Hollywood is something that is so delicate, that is so subject to going up and down at even the smallest thing that happens, that I do not believe for a second that Lana Wachowski would take these actors and actresses that she really likes and respects, like Jessica Henwick, Yahya Abdul-Mateen, and Jonathan Groff, and just put their careers at risk by making a deliberately bad movie. That just does not... I think that at best you could say that the movie was constructed in a way to protect it from criticism, and the people that are saying that the movie was made bad on purpose are kind of, in a sense, I wouldn't say falling for her trap, but they're doing exactly what Lana constructed the movie to do, which is to, in my opinion, kind of be cowardly by incessantly hedging your bets and creating something that at least is clever enough to never be criticized. But I'm calling bullshit on that and saying that it should be criticized. So ultimately, I think that this movie potentially violates all of the things that The Matrix Resurrections is, considers itself guilty of, which is like, shameless profiteering off of art and, doing something that artists involved with the franchise said they would never do, whether it's another sequel or mixing franchises or anything. And yet Spider-Man accomplishes making a great movie. Not only that, but I would say even nails it and does it without being clever, without being self-aware, by just, taking filmmaking seriously. So finally, I want to talk about what I think this movie and its enormous success means for the future of cinema. So back when The Dark Knight was made in 2007, it also made a huge change in cinema due to its amazing box office numbers. And it made the studios reconsider their approach. And their approach was, we got to make movies darker. And that in many ways led to the DCEU, which, has been various shades of catastrophic. And I think that was the wrong learning to take from The Dark Knight. I think other things that should have been taken from it was just, again, some of the things that I've mentioned before: performance, pace, rhythm, tone, emotion, those things that were all masterfully executed in The Dark Knight. And my concern is that this movie, all that people are going to take away from it is that we should encourage more IP from different worlds to collide. But again, this movie's greatest achievement is that it works despite the colliding franchises. It tells a story that works within a single world. This is a scenario in which it's even more difficult to keep people emotionally involved and their disbelief suspended, because there's so much from outside the story of the world going into making this movie possible. And yet they did it. And they did it by not shying away from the power of performance, the power of narrative, and the power of establishing a tone that captures people's imaginations and hearts. And I'm so happy that this movie is succeeding. And I'm so happy that even me, a diehard Matrix fan, I'm so happy that this movie is succeeding at the same time that The Matrix Resurrections is not succeeding. Because we don't need more smarmy self-awareness. We don't need more meta stuff. We need brave filmmakers who are willing to take big emotional swings. Because at the end of the day, stories in general are most powerful when they tug at your emotional heartstrings. And it's not an easy thing to do. And, we may try to hedge our bets just in case we fail at conveying emotion, because it's really hard to do by trying to be relentlessly clever. And I think Joss Whedon did a lot of that, and I'm glad that era, I hope this marks, it comes to an end. Now, I just want to end by saying some hot takes. These are my hot takes for predictions of the future. So, hot take number 1, Disney will buy DC, and we will see Christian Bale play Batman again. And then my fiery hot take is that in the future, the first fully CGI performance in cinema will be Heath Ledger doing the Joker again, and it will probably be integrated into some kind of Disney Marvel Cinematic Universe thing. And again, if they do it, obviously there's a big risk that they'll do it horribly. But I hope they don't. I hope they do it like this movie. I hope they do it like Spider-Man No Way Home and just use those elements that are there necessarily to create a marketing hype event and use it to make a better story and not just as an excuse for the story to exist. So that's it from me, guys. Thanks a lot for watching. We got a new season of South Park starting next week, so I'll be posting some videos and some reviews of those things. So don't forget to subscribe. I've been having a lot of fun doing this channel, and would love to hear some recommendations of things that you'd like to see me do. There are some book reviews and some stuff that I've been meaning to do, but I just haven't gotten around to it. But you can be rest assured that 2022 is going to be a fun year of content experimentation for me, and I'm looking forward to it. So for those of you who are willing to join me on the adventure, thank you for your subscription, and hope to see you next time. Thanks a lot, guys. Peace.